And it's going to be my pleasure to introduce my dear friend from Bangalore, Ravi, who heads the Apollo Hospital Pulmonary and Critical Care sections. Ravi is a gifted speaker, 75 plus publications. Ravi is a nationally and internationally famous invasive bronchoscopist. He makes complex hair-raising procedures look easy. Perhaps that's why he's taken on the mantle of seeing if patients with COVID can be treated not just with drugs and quarantine, but extending that level of care to oxygen as well. So, Ravi, I've really been looking forward to your talk. Welcome, and sorry for crossing my time by a few minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Zarid. Can you guys hear me and see my screen?
We can.
Okay, lovely. Well, as usual, amazing, stupendous, comprehensive, and thought-provoking talk, Zarid. And one, I have to thank you and Albert for calling me on this screen. But I do have a few peeves which I'd like to put in the beginning, just like disclaimers of medications, which you so adroitly pointed out. First of all, I get to follow all these lovely speakers who are acing it in their own right. Secondly, I get to follow you. And thirdly, I get to take on a topic which anyway everybody seems to be smiling and snickering in the background as we try to take it on in a very unusual platform where nothing seems to be working. So with this nice advantage to my credit, we will start on this particular agenda. And I have retitled it so that I start the discussion in a very thinking way. Is that can oxygen be given safely at home to the hypoxemic COVID-19 patient, which you mentioned? I accepted in the beginning, and as the days have passed by, I have slowly regretted it to the point today where I completely was sitting with my head in my hands, as you must have been after seeing the Solidarity trial. But nevertheless, we will go and try and do justice to it, because certainly a lot of work has been done in this field. The name of this concept is COVID hot therapy, home oxygen therapy. So those of you who think the title is interesting and fascinating for a morose and despairing topic, understand it's just an acronym. And we have titled it as a flight of fancy or a provocative idea which wedged its way in, as has happened in the COVID pandemic. So today's flow in the time given to us is the need for oxygen, very standard, everybody knows that. The statement of need of this particular concept, how did this question arise? And then comes the most important thing we're asking. If we took around 8-9 months to look at repurposed drugs and try and question them, then we have to look at where we consider our mecca of care, which is a hospital. And we ask this question as we have put in the screen. And then we talk about out-of-the-box innovations in India. And here I seek forgiveness from you, Zarir, as I weave a tale. But since everyone's weaved a very nice tale, I think I stand a little absorbed. And I leave a quote which I will perhaps reuse later, that desperate necessity is the mother of unthinkable innovations, which sets the stage for this topic. Of course, we cannot be all rhetoric, as you have rightly said in your talk. So we need some data. And then we'll analyze the entire talk and summarize the whole the talk in the time we have over here. So it's not difficult to talk of this particular aspect. When is oxygen required in COVID-19? And we have many of these recommendations. In fact, you get probably inundated with the numerous recommendations, some of which are redundant. At the same time, you are compelled to see them because some of them may be regulating your state laws, as Anmita was pointing out. So clearly here people say that when your oxygen starts to fall, and that is variously talked about, you need to give oxygen to maintain a target of 92 to 96%. And even this is being questioned now with two complete different sides, where one side says maybe more and one side says less. And the Indian government got up, especially in Karnataka, where we had a hue and cry that we don't have oxygen, for God's sake, start using less compared to more. So anyway, this was the guideline which came over there. Awake proning seems to be the phoenix which rose from the little areas it was used in, and it became one of the most common things, easy to talk about, no cost at all, just needs effort and convincing. And then, of course, came the rest of the stuff, which is part of routine COVID monitoring. Bottom line is people who desaturate should be getting oxygen, and of course, they should be looked at more carefully. And then we look at the WHO, which has gone through various stages. Its initial role as a world manager or world observer for COVID has been questioned, the way things were done. And then the statements made and the statements retracted. And then its attempt to come back by doing all these studies such as Solidarity and trying to make sure that we have the right data on the ground. So the WHO's role itself has shaken, much like COVID has shaken the whole world over there. WHO also says that by and large 90 is your trigger, and understand that this is the ease which is given to you. Understand that a saturation of 90 in the world of what's called PO2 or measurement of arterial blood gases corresponds to any PO2 of anywhere from 40 to 110. So we really don't know whether the number actually reflects what we want to look at, which is circulatory sufficiency. It actually just reflects a common number which can be given, measured by instrument called a pulse oximeter, which may be anywhere from made in China to made in Japan. And you have to rely on that as being one of the single most important indicators to decide on one of the only therapies left to have any life-saving importance, which is oxygen therapy. I mean, besides the steroids that we talked about. So understand that the whole science is slightly flawed, but for the purpose of practicality, this has been put out there. And so all of these guys recommended or implied admission. You can't do this at home. But of course, it was the biggest gap between proclamation and practice happened when a whole deluge of patients descended onto our woefully unprepared hospitals. And that is when we started to see more problems, and problems we never saw before. And this is what actually happened over there. And these headlines, which I have picked from the internet over time, reflect the story of COVID, which is absolutely horrific, sad, and ultimately regretful as we realize what a job we had done over there. And it started early, as you guys in Mumbai, unfortunately, were the opening batsmen in the whole COVID pandemic. And you can see such headlines became more and more common, where people were dying over there. And of course, there was always some encouraging note that the municipal corporation is going to get its act into shape. And then came the next headline. This is May, as you can see in the newspaper, that Mumbai runs out of hospital beds. So clearly, as Amita rightfully pointed out and Zari reinforced, it's not easy to say, okay, lovely, get hospitalized as we used to do before. These hospital beds were on a premium as never seen before, with stakes never imagined earlier. Then, of course, came the more horrific aspect, which we may have seen in training, but that was an occasional thing and never to be talked in a pandemic, as we try to reconcile this social distancing gaps and all sorts of precautions with what was happening. And sharing beds seemed to be the most horrific thing which could hit any headline and make your blood curdle, as you see that this is pretty much saying you might as well consign patients to the grave before you even give them a chance. And then, of course, this spread to Delhi. And Delhi, as it was watching with all its wisdom and all its resources, was watching Mumbai, seemed to learn little. And I will reiterate this paradigm that each city seems to have functioned in a silo, and then the subsequent city seems to have learned scant or nothing, to put it very crudely, from its sister or brother concern. And here New Delhi sees the same thing over there, and the hospital bed story is again repeated. You just change the headline from city to city, month after month. And then came finally Karnataka. So our city and our state was actually lauded for being lovely, great, stalling the COVID pandemic, doing all the right things. But I think anybody who has taken credit and sits gloating in the COVID pandemic must eat humble pie. That has been the unfortunate story, whether it's been drugs, actions, thought leaders of the world, or the like. And so in our city also, we started to see this, and we should have been prepared. We saw it after Mumbai and Delhi. We again had our death deluge. And finally, again, the same thing, that people are struggling, people are dying on the street, and so on and so forth. Finally, you can see the date now. I've moved from March to August, a span of 5 months in less than 3 minutes. Private hospitals ultimately launched innovative plans. And then came this magic word called home assessment, where finally the system, the government, the centers accepted that the patient should be assessed for home care or require hospitalization. An extremely compelled strategy, which was logically present everywhere in the world, but we had decided to wear blinkers as we saw the pandemic go from city to city, even in our country. So the situation was a mess, and many minds started to think as the death roll of COVID continued. And it has actually been a travesty to humankind. We've talked of Rwanda and all those things, all those countries being genocidal. And I think somewhere COVID-19 strategies, thought processes, actions, and ultimately on the ground results would reflect a similar result. Money and power could not get you hospital bed. And as we're looking at Mumbai being very close to our hearts, a lot of us studied over there. Can we do something for these patients till they get a bed? Is there any point that they run from hospital to hospital, emergency room to emergency room, and they go from saturations of say 85 to 70 to 60, and even if you get them into a hospital, with all what you do for them, they ultimately die. So then the big question came on, which has been partly addressed, I mean, actually overwhelmingly addressed by my last two speakers. Do all patients actually need the hospital bed? Can we evaluate what is the value addition of the hospital? And this is a core question we have never asked ourselves, as we are intuitive practitioners who decide that we know by our sixth sense and our large amount of experience and knowledge and papers that who needs to get admitted. We never ask ourselves that when we put a patient in a hospital, what are we actually doing? Amita mentioned the fact that they are completely, for the first time in existence, devoid of any family support. So is our actions, which include non-medical medications and others like instrumentation, intensive care, actually doing something? So this sort of soul searching is something we don't like to do, but it started to become part of the thought process as we said, okay, let's think now, because clearly what we are doing doesn't seem to be working, and it's not us in India, it seems to be the whole world. The only thing is we don't seem to be networking enough to be learning from other people's experiences and implementing them in our own particular setups. So we came up with this, we just crashed ahead and a few of us were talking, and my colleague and friend and Zarir's friend too from Hinduja Hospital, a nephrologist. And clearly, as this particular forum also demonstrates, COVID has not been the prerogative of any one field. Anybody and everybody who has a decent background, medical background, thinking prowess and application and commitment can add to it. We then put our mind together and we said that can we do point of care or home-based care, which would be a paradigm shift. And this reflects part of the home care paradigm, which my two colleagues were talking about. But my area of discussion is oxygen. But I will be taking it in the context of a major program. So this is what we talked about. And my colleague also at work was very interested. And we started to look at this very carefully. And so we put a plan out there where we looked at the data. And Zarir had pointed out the fact that, of course, a lot of these patients don't require aggressive therapy. But let's look at it a little more provocatively. This was the problem statement. People running around in panic, fear, and thinking for that the emergency room or the hospital is going to save their lives, and not so. The delay in reaching them, the shift from center to center, the fatigue of healthcare, the helplessness of healthcare was actually one of the major reasons that these people were getting delayed for the vital minimalistic care, including oxygen, which should have saved their lives potentially. Then the data across Maharashtra showed that even if you admit them, you're not doing much over there. We talked of value addition of hospitalized care. In such a situation, we are only giving them simple oxygen, meds, as is now being pointed out, we don't know work or no. So what are we actually doing? They're sitting on a bed out there. They're getting oxygen therapy. They're getting medications which we don't know work at all. There is hardly any monitoring in the PP spectrum. And those of us who go in these hospitals will, unfortunately admit that the care can never be the same as non-COVID times. And then ultimately they're eating food which also may not be, Roshni's standards, not even remotely close to it. And so what are we ultimately doing there? And so the whole question came down that can we take a good deal of these patients and manage them in an environment such as their house, which would be way better than what we are doing. And this is the largest slice of humble pie than we can take. So we came up with a proposal for actually policy makers. And we said that why not shift the care using all the technology tools which have jumped up and sprung up in the COVID paradigm? Why not have an e-consult with an expert anyway who's not doing much work at this point, and above 60 anyway, more than 90% had decided to take a break when it came to active COVID care. And then we mentioned things like, which I won't go into details at this point, basically make it point of care. If I can pick up a telephone, a smartphone, and get in touch with somebody who in a standardized platform can deal with my issues, assess me and advise me, we may be able to avoid this deluge of patients running around and not getting hospital beds. In that, we incorporated what is the topic today, assessing the need for oxygen therapy. And if the bed was not available, can we go the next step in this COVID pandemic when nothing is working, and plan oxygen at point of care, similar to what we have done for so many pulmonary patients over the years, and then continue all what my colleague said, proactive monitoring, a plan for them, giving them oxygen where they really need it, and not making them run from place to place and die in the process. and of course prone position which you and I take for granted is not known to the common patient, and walking them through in as an adjunct to oxygen therapy or pending oxygen therapy certainly will make a difference was the proposition. And so this little graph, which I'll not go into detail, pretty much said the same thing for a policymaker to try and understand this, where we said oxygen requirement assessment and providing them oxygen at home in case you don't have a bed or you're waiting for a bed is smarter than running around center to center, hither and thither, trying to get your hospital bed, which is not happening. We also put another provocative idea out there, which was a big thing, that can we have a centralized bed listing and allocation system? Then these patients, while they're waiting at home and we're going the next level of giving them oxygen so that they don't go here and there, will then be prioritized on that. And if the bed comes up in a first time, God truthful, honest system in our country, we'll be able to triage them and give them the bed, as against my brother, your uncle, or somebody else's grandfather who basically knows the trustee or has a government pull or looks like he's part of the socio-political hierarchy of this country. So that was we promulgated out there, and believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, it has happened in a good deal of the cities where Mumbai ultimately has it. Karnataka had, and Bangalore has a very robust bed allocation system, but this was put forward out there. If all these can be put together, then we may be able to impact on COVID mortality much more than the medications we want to believe in and the therapies which are not working at this point. We knocked on many doors with these ideas. All of us, and Zarir has been very helpful in that. And we put it in the public space also. And the multiple doors we knocked on were endless. The Mumbai task force, where Zarir got us a foothold, who gave us a patient hearing. The Tata Trust, because we believe Ratan Tata's WhatsApp saying that I will give my life for this country would be there. The Mahindra Foundation, Credai, who's the real estate big honchos who control thousands of crores in this country, Niti Aayog. And in our own state, when it hit us, we knocked on the Infosys Foundation. I have personally met the Karnataka Deputy Chief Minister, put my idea in front of the Karnataka Expert Committee, which later incorporated us, but at that time we were outsiders. We went to the Secretary of Health Karnataka. Many, many doors were knocked. And ultimately to put it in the newspaper, because we believe that media will act more than a randomized controlled trial at this point. Jatin and I put this managed to get the article accepted in one of the leading newspapers, who saw this idea was provocative. Finally, when we were close to saying, okay, this is not going to work, maybe things don't work in a pandemic the way you want to. And of course, the fact is, let's understand that most of the policymakers are more bureaucrats than clinicians. It was, we took a backseat and concentrated on the work. And finally, an unexpected knock on a door after so many emails and efforts. And this is what the knock on the door was. One of our local members of parliament called Tejasvi Surya, young 29-year-old, actually approached us one day, and then this plan was picked up, including the oxygen component, which we are supposed to talk about today. And he put a bunch of young people here, and all of them are basically startups. Bangalore is known for startups, startup leaders in their own right, Practo, and so on and so forth, many of these guys. And they worked tirelessly for 3 weeks with the usual WhatsApp group chattering day in and day out, with me unable to keep up with their enthusiasm, but being the proposer of the idea had to do that. And so finally, this came out as COVID Raksha, which was also tabled in Parliament as this young MP went and talked about the efforts made in our country and our city. And you can say this office basically got so many of these guys together. Swast is a digital platform you guys must have heard. It was the biggest ventures which came from our IT crowd over here with unrestricted grants. Project Step One is a bunch of doctors who are doing day in and day out voluntary duty. Portia rose to the occasion. It's a home care provider, and they agreed to give these oxygen concentrators. The oxygen component was the most challenging, because clearly receiving a call, these guys can do. Giving service, these guys can do. Project Step One had a whole bunch of doctors who were regular, allopathic doctors. But oxygen confused them because this had never been seen before. So that was something which was also provocatively and interestingly added to the algorithm. No idea walks alone. I believe that obviously necessity, as we said, leads to so many people rising to the occasion. I was talking offline to Zarir also, who mentioned how people are asking him, apartment complexes want to run, small isolation beds to the point of even some intensive care beds in their particular clubhouses and so on. And meanwhile, Zydus, one of the companies, came out with this particular scheme where they said, we can give you oxygen. And I called the Zydus people to get data from their success over there. This is the sort of numbers they did. And they managed to give a decent number of people home oxygen in the time they required. And as Zari showed, many CCCs planned oxygen, and which is done all across the country. The oxygen requirement in the country has gone up 5 to 10%, ladies and gentlemen. 5 to 10% increase in the concentrators, cylinders, and the like sold in our country after this particular awareness came over there. And the privately stocked concentrator cylinders is innumerable, and it'll be interesting to see how many of these come back into circulation after COVID goes away from the scene. Then comes the literature aspect. Is home O2 an alien concept, or do we have something going on? I always believe that when you're thinking of an idea, there's always people in other parts of the world who are looking at the same thing. It's like a cosmic phenomenon, especially in crisis. And simultaneously, as we were pushing through right from May through July with our idea, came this paper, is home O2 for a concept we should think about? And this was a collaboration of the futuristic who was working on this. They came up with a guideline that included people from everywhere. You have UK, you have Europe, you have Netherlands, Italy, all those guys who suffered. You have the United States of America, all of them were there. And peculiarly, I noticed that the sixth name out there came from SUNY Downstate, which is my medical, my residency program in the United States. It was uncanny when I saw this name in this particular paper. What were the highlights of this paper? In the amount of time we will not dwell on that at length, and we'll be happy to pass it on to anybody or the slides if anybody wants to see them. They introduced the concept of short-term oxygen therapy and said that yes, it can be used in COVID, and HOT, which is home oxygen therapy, and STOT can be done with as long as you put processes and thinking and safety mechanisms into place. And they put a big statement out there with all sorts of headings, which I will not dwell on, but they went through all the checklists of what is important, from the rationale to the point of capabilities. And it's so uncanny that the same term had been used by all of us when we were trying to push this concept. They talked of risk assessment, which my colleagues touched on. They talked of initiation of home services and oxygen therapy being an important part of it. They went on to expound on community management, and they, of course, put a high concept of a specialty follow-up team. Zarid mentioned the need to follow up regularly. And then, of course, the instruments were talked about at length. And so these guys have put a very comprehensive document out there, and such algorithms are put over there. And how are you going to do it? How the home oxygen team is contacting the patient? Whom do you decide to keep at home? Whom do you decide to get into the hospital? How are you going to look for the guy who worsens? And all the questions anybody will ask when they think of this with horror in their eyes. And they came with very interesting tools, which was even revealing to me when I was reading it, a breathlessness screening tool, which seems to be a surrogate for oximetry too, where they say that if you count on a single breath less than 7, or time between consecutive breaths is less than 5 seconds, it is 90% or less with sensitivity of 87% or so. Very, very interesting. So a whole bunch of prior literature, clinical algorithms, safety mechanisms, and systems were attempted to be espoused as the way home oxygen therapy should be done. Now let's come back. We are India, and we have to look at what happens in our country of 1.2 billion, 4 Americas and 20 Italys. Is this possible at all? Well, the buy-in is possible only when we believe that this is important and the need is there. And that is when the system takes charge. Multiple stakeholders, including us and most of my co-healthcare providers, is going to smile and say, this guy is off his knocker when he talks this way. But clearly, you understand that the need came from the fact that people were dying on the streets despite having resources because the hospital bed was not there. And of course, economically, which is important, but not the main thing, does matter. But if you don't give people a sense of safety and don't define the criteria and don't make them feel that they can care of, this is never going to work. So what actually happened in our country? Well, we suffered from absolute primitive, primordial, and Paleolithic emotions, which none of us can deny happened to each one of us sometime or the other. Fear, panic, sudden deterioration. The word cytokine storm has been more of a storm than I've ever seen in my entire COVID experience, frankly, and we're still looking that carefully. Hospital bed became a premium entity. The bed, which is so important a resource, got demoted to what if I get worse and I don't get a bed? Let me plant myself over there. It became like basically a savings account more than anything else. In the process, genuine patients did not get the bed, and the precious, limited, sparse, and scarce healthcare resources and PPE went towards the one who did not need it. The biggest exercise of malutilization, which has been probably done this year and probably the history of any healthcare efforts. The home O2 paradigm has happened in part, whether believe it or not. It happened where beds are not available, and each one of us has had to somehow make sure these patients got temporary oxygen, STOT. Patients chose not to come to hospitals, and a whole bunch of elderly malignancy guys and patients who are sitting moribund from Parkinson's, neuromuscular, with savvy
25
family
minutes,
and aligned healthcare providers agreed to do that. Sorry?
25 minutes over. So,
Oh, sorry, I'll just finish in a minute. And so de-escalation from the hospital became the next common thing also. So ultimately, Zarir and Amita have showed that if we plan it, whom do we do? And clearly, the patients who are unstable should not be getting it. And in a confessional aspect, as I said, that we've had it in a limited way for the groups which we talked about. So to summarize the whole talk, HOT or home oxygen therapy is provocative. It has it has a good deal of traction in the West, and a lot of organized systems are talking about it. Few takers in India with minimalistic application, which we talked about, and a concept propounded ahead of its time in India, maybe can be planned more systematically. A natural corollary from a system point of view, but few takers when it comes to fear, panic, worry, and I need the hospital bed. I end with this particular paradigm. What we have discussed is out of the box. COVID has been the impetus for innovation. Desperate necessity is the mother of unthinkable innovations. If we can have an ICU this way, I mean, look at us this way. We've learned to wear masks for hours together as we never planned, done procedures using gear, which none of us know who's there behind, and still have to do it for safety. We can certainly acknowledge the fact that when all hell breaks loose, every out-of-the-box idea can be given thought. I end with my title, COVID HOT concept is a flight of fancy or a provocative idea, but it did wedge its way in. Thank you very much for the close attention, and apologies for the overshooting. I will stop sharing my screen.
Ravi, excellent talk. This has really been your proud baby, and you've carried it through almost to conception. Keep going, because I think it's a concept which is really needed.